The year is 1817, and the citizens of New Orleans live in constant fear of one man. His name is Jean Lafitte. What follows is a true story of greed, betrayal, death, and buried treasure. It's me, and you're watching this channel. Back in the early 1800s, the world was a dangerous place, especially for merchants and sailors on the open waters. A sailor's life was fraught with peril, and there were few things that inspired more fear than hearing the telltale sound of cannon fire. And if you weren't a skilled sailor and you heard the boom of cannons nearby, you hoped that they were firing on someone else. Because if they were firing on you, your fate was sealed. Lafitte commands a fleet of ships that prowl the Gulf of Mexico and prey on unarmed vessels. These were swift and maneuverable ships that were ideal for stealthily approaching slow-moving cargo ships and quickly overrunning their defenses. Once he chose his victim, it was game over. Lafitte's crew would board the vessel and plunder its holds. They would take whatever merchandise they could, and they would destroy whatever they couldn't. Then they would return to shore and sell what they stole through a smuggling network that's based in New Orleans. So imagine for a moment you're sitting at home and you hear the sounds of a knock at your door. You open up the door and you see a swashbuckling Frenchman standing on your stoop with a saber at his side and holding a pistol in one hand and some fancy merchandise in the other. That might have been the reality of a lot of people living in New Orleans. And speaking of Jean Lafitte, though, he was not your typical pirate. He wasn't just a person that went around pillaging on the high seas. He was actually the final version of pirates, so you have the Golden Age pirates who are working for themselves, but he's effectively working as a cartel or mob boss. There's a misconception that pirates were common folk who wanted to escape society, but Lafitte was educated, refined, spoke several languages. He really caught the imagination of the American people because he was a bit of a showman. And he was considered to be something of a folk hero, like a latter-day Robin Hood to the people of southern Louisiana. Well, there may have been a grain of truth to that. Jean Lafitte was something of a Robin Hood character to the people of New Orleans, but Lafitte himself was nothing more than a ruthless businessman. Lawrence, let's talk about Jean's shipping route that he built along the Gulf of Mexico. We talked a bit about this already, but Lafitte started up a whole smuggling network that stretched from Florida all the way to South Texas. Now, to understand the nature of Jean Lafitte's piracy, we need to understand what was valuable at the time. Obviously, tobacco and cotton were prized commodities, but so was something else: slaves. Now, at this point, the transatlantic slave trade had largely been shut down, and so the people who were trafficking in slaves, they had to come up with a new plan. Rather than bringing enslaved people across the Atlantic Ocean, they began importing them via Africa through the Caribbean and into the southernmost parts of the United States. Lafitte would steal slaves off of these slave ships, and then he would keep them in storehouses up and down the Gulf of Mexico until he could sell them. It was estimated that at one point he had over 2,000 slaves that he was holding captive in these storehouses, waiting for the opportune moment to sell them. During his heyday, he was said to have made about $1 million a year, so we're talking about billions of dollars worth of merchandise. So Lafitte was one of the wealthiest men in the Caribbean, and it's a real mystery, not only what happened to him, but what happened to all that treasure. In total, Lafitte amassed a fortune that historians estimate to be worth over $1 billion in today's currency. And despite his death in the murky swamps of the Gulf of Mexico, rumors persist that his ill-gotten gains remain hidden somewhere in the murky waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And yes, many people have tried to search for his lost treasure, but so far none have been successful. Now, unfortunately, the details surrounding Jean Lafitte's early life are uncertain, but there's two prevailing theories. The first theory says that he was born in France in the late 1700s, while the second says that he was born around Port-au-Prince. Both theories claim that he and his brother Pierre become very good seamen at a young age. They're taught how to fight with swords, how to shoot a pistol, how to command a giant sailing ship, and there's even legends that at one point they joined the French Navy to go and fight in the Napoleonic Wars. And this is very plausible given the fact that the Lafitte brothers knew how to navigate and fight on the high seas. And given the fact that there was a lot of naval battles going on in the Caribbean at the time, it makes sense that they would have gotten involved in that. Then in 1803, one of the most consequential events in American history takes place. Napoleon's France sells the Louisiana Territory to the United States for a sum of $15 million. The United States gains all of the territory up and down the Mississippi River and west to the Rockies. This doubled the size of the United States overall and gave some territory that stretched from the East Coast almost all the way to the West Coast. So strategically, New Orleans is now in a position where it's one of the major trading hubs of the United States. This really transformed the people living there, or at least transformed their taste, their desires in certain kinds of ways. They're rich, or wanted to seem rich, and this is the Lafitte's wheelhouse. Lawrence. So the brothers set up shop in New Orleans. But let's talk about how Jean Lafitte first emerges onto the scene. Lafitte first emerges, at least in official records, around 1805. He and his brother Pierre own a warehouse in the bustling port city of New Orleans, where they are able to distribute their goods that they've acquired from various means. So we're talking tobacco, coffee, some indigo, cotton, to some extent textiles. He often had those luxury goods to offer to the population when they couldn't get them. But then in 1807, an act of Congress starts Lafitte down a darker path. Amidst the turmoil of Napoleon's wars in Europe, American trade vessels are under attack by both the British and the French. So the United States passes the Embargo Act of 1807 that prohibits not only the importation of foreign goods into the U.S., but also the importation of slaves. Because it does not outright outlaw slavery, what it does is actually incentivize people who are dealing in the illegal importation and trade of slaves. For someone such as Jean Lafitte, these acts actually only open new business opportunities for him. And while the U.S. government was hoping to stop the smuggling of goods, they inadvertently opened the floodgates for people like Jean Lafitte, who had been selling legal goods before this act, but now could only sell illegal goods. So you can see how the wheels in his mind might start turning. By this point, Lafitte had established a reputation for himself in the community as a legitimate businessman. But behind closed doors, he and his men were doing questionable things. They were running guns and ammunition to both sides of the warring factions in the Caribbean. So when the Embargo Act of 1807 passed, Lafitte shifted from running guns to privateering. But this is where things get kind of complicated because technically Lafitte was still a businessman. He was still the same guy who had a shop front in New Orleans. And yes, he was preying on ships and stealing their valuables, but he justified it because he said he was a privateer. The line between pirate and privateer is thin and very, very blurry, but essentially a pirate is illegal and is engaged in attacking and thieving. Privateers do similar things, but they do so under the guise of some sort of legitimacy. The difference is this: privateers sail under what's known as a letter of marque, which is something granting sanction to the stealing of goods for nations at war. Lafitte claimed to be first a French privateer, and then a privateer operating under the letter of marque of a small independent nation called Cartagena. In reality, he was never taking resources back to Cartagena. He was working for himself, but becoming a privateer gave him some guise of legitimacy in case he ever got stopped by officials that he couldn't outwit. By 1811, pirates were commonplace in the Gulf of Mexico, and the U.S. government was doing very little to stop them. So for 4 years, Lafitte grew his privateering enterprise and became even richer and more powerful. Lawrence, meanwhile, as tensions rise between the U.S. and France, people in New Orleans begin to grow weary of Lafitte's illegal activities. The U.S. government begins pressing charges against Lafitte for his role in smuggling and piracy. And so it's clear that he needs to disappear and take his fortune with him. In 1817, Lafitte learns that the U.S. Navy is looking for him, and he flees to a marsh just west of New Orleans, known locally as the Barataria Swamp. He builds a camp here and hides out for the next 5 years. But it's not long before the U.S. Navy finds him and opens fire. With cannons blazing, Lafitte's men abandon their ships, the U.S. Navy burns several of them, and they're able to capture $500,000 of Lafitte.